Heel hartelijk welkom bij deze presentatie van het onderzoeksrapport Dealing with Decoupling. Before I continue, I want to check whether everybody here speaks Dutch, and also perhaps the people at home, because I was under the impression that that was the case, but if not, then we switch to English. Nederlands, okay?
English.
Who's already in? Well, yes, who's already present will do his presentation in English anyway, but that means we have to make a slight alteration. But I don't think that's going to be too big a problem. So again, a very warm welcome also to the people at home. We've got about roughly 50 participants, divided half here in the Wijnhavengebouw in Den Haag, and half at home online. So a very warm welcome to all of you. To join the presentation of Dealing with Decoupling, which is a research project which I loosely formulated or summarized as decoupling hoe dan in proper Dutch. So how do we do the decoupling? This was a research project for which the initial idea I think started roughly somewhere in 2022. And the reason, or one of the let's say the causes, I'm looking for the word, the aanleiding for this research project was of course the war in Ukraine, but also the competitive battle between the US and China, and the impact that that has on international business, foreign business with their operations in China. So this research has been conducted by leading researcher Frank Pieke, who's here in the room. People at home can't see him yet, but will in a minute. And of course, Bert Hofman, who is joining us from Jakarta. Very warm welcome to you. Speaker Frank Pieke is a professor and working currently at the National University of Singapore at the East Asia Institute, and that's the same institute that Bert used to be the director of, as well as having worked for the World Bank for more than 20 years, I believe, and he was country director in China. So the credentials are big. So we have, for this meeting, we have about an hour. And after this meeting, we can further down the road join, if you want to join us and talk a bit more about the project with Frank Pieke. There will be drinks served in the Hofhouse further down the road. So firstly, I would like to give Bert Hofman the floor to introduce the data. So the research itself is consists of interviews and surveys and with companies, roughly 70 companies from the Netherlands, Germany, Singapore, and Japan, as well as data analysis. And the data analysis, Bert Hofman will first clarify using graphs that he will put on the screen in. Ask Frank Pieke a few questions, and then there will be enough time for questions left, hopefully. So Bert, please take it away.
All right, thank you. Can everybody hear me all right? Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
All right, very good. Thank you. So this project, as Floor has already said, originated 22. We started working in April 23. And at that point, we really thought, well, it's not yet that clear that there's actually in the data and the trade and investment data an awful lot of decoupling already visible. So the main dish, if you want, is really the interviews with companies to see how they deal with decoupling, how they deal with US-China tensions, what are their strategies going forward? Because our thinking was, well, those strategies will gradually show up in the statistics. But as we were working, there's more and more that we found in the statistics as well, and that's what I'm going to do. So Frank Pieke is the principal investigator. I helped write the report, and we have Ruma Aoyama, Emma Burgers, Ryan Ho, Hongtuan Yuan, Tansha Hao, and Eric Si Zhang as co-researchers, and there's one more person who didn't want to be managed, but we should also acknowledge her as one of the researchers on this project. So whether in statistics or not, decoupling is definitely the talk of the town. And this is a simple word count in Dow Jones Factiva, which is an assembly of thousands of magazines, newspapers from around the world. And you see that terms like de-risking, a new Cold War, and decoupling really are the talk of the town. And you should look at the right-hand side. So the decoupling still wins, even though de-risking is sort of catching up. It starts to increase the talk, the gossip, if you want, on decoupling after the Trump administration starts. But more so, and that is especially with the de-risking the case, you see after early 22, and of course that is the invasion, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you see that increasing. Bloomberg has a wonderful database. I see one person of Bloomberg online that looks at the company briefings of their investors. And only after March 2022, you really see the concern of geopolitics spiking. So before it was, if you wanted, the planning department, and much of scenarios were made, but then it becomes CEO business and investor business. Meanwhile, politics is already decoupling. You see here a chart of cumulative trade measures from 2009 to 2023 from Global Trade Alert, and the harmful measures have really started to accelerate. And the main culprit, well, we don't want to mention name, but it is the United States, who has been implementing lots of measures that are detrimental to international trade, according to the Global Trade Alert. Quite a few of those, and this is WTO data, quite a few of those are motivated by national security concern. There is a reporting requirement for measures that you take motivated by national security, because there's a special clause in the GATT agreement on national security, and that has gradually drifted up, and it's now more than 200 measures that are motivated by national security concerns. So, and frankly, I see that only rising in future. Despite these measures, if you want, fortunately, globalization, as expressed in the trade in services and merchandise and foreign direct investment, is really moving sideways. It is not yet, we're not yet deglobalizing. It's not yet a complete collapse. And as a matter of fact, there were strong rebounds after the global financial crisis, and again, strong rebounds after the COVID crisis of 2020. Nevertheless, all these data are a bit polluted by the COVID crisis, and they're a little messy as a consequence of that. Why we think that from the data, you can only, in the end, have quite tentative conclusions, and the messages from the companies are probably stronger than from the data. But we do see shifts, and starting with investments, we see definitely a shift away from China. Now, this is not real investment yet, I'll come to that, but this is announced FDI project, both greenfield and mergers and acquisitions, and this is the composition over the Asia Pacific. And whereas China in the 2010s up until 2018, where it had the peak, it had the largest share in the whole of the Asia Pacific, that has come down quite dramatically, and especially 2022 is the lowest. And so this will result into future much lower foreign direct investment in China. One of the winners, if you want, at least in announcements, is definitely India. Unfortunately, if you look at the correlation between actual flows and announced flows to India, India is not a great performer, but the rest of Asia is doing relatively well. There is cases such as Vietnam and Indonesia that are relatively strong, at least in the announcement. So the intent to shift foreign direct investments away from China elsewhere. The IMF has done a global analysis, and they looked at global flows, and strikingly, so now a bit naughtily, they look at the number of projects and only the greenfield projects, not the M&As. And M&A is actually an important component. But nevertheless, if you look at the column here, China is really way down in terms of numbers of foreign direct investment projects from any region in the world. And this is until 2022, so it's not the end of the data yet, but these are again intentions, not yet real. But in real money, China is also losing, and we have data until 2022. The new ones are 23 numbers are gradually coming out. But China is really after its peak in 2018, in terms of global market share, it is going down, just like the announcements before. So there is clearly something that is moving away from China. Interesting also is that you see that shares of the G7, especially the United States, but to some extent Europe and Japan, is increasing. So if you want, it is, and G7 countries are the major source of foreign direct investment. They're increasingly investing into G7 countries themselves, and including the EU, I should say. Now, focusing on China, and the numbers for 2023 show a major decline in the green bar, a less major decline in the blue bar. There's two types of foreign direct investment numbers in China, and that hints a little bit at the strategies that Frank will discuss later on. FDI inflows, this is balance of payment. You see a major collapse of inflows of foreign direct investment. Major peak in 2021, major collapse in 2023. As a matter of fact, for the first time in the third quarter of 23, it was negative. That's in part macroeconomics. Some of those flows are not really bricks and mortar foreign direct investment, but it's more portfolio flow. But nevertheless, this has raised big concerns. The FDI utilization is a bit more closer to bricks and mortars. That's going down, but it's not collapsing, if you want, as the FDI flows. And in part that is because a number of the companies that are already there, they continue to be there. And as a matter of fact, they reinvest still their profits in China, and they, if you want, implement projects that have been decided a couple of years back. So that moves much slower than the balance of payment numbers. Moving to trade, and trade, China has been a big part of trade, first on the up and then on the down, if you want. Of course, ever since China entered the WTO, there was a major peak of China's total trade in its GDP. And that peaked just before the global financial crisis at about 60%. Since then, a lot has happened in China's trade. First of all, a lot of trade became onshored in China, and therefore it doesn't show up as trade anymore. Basically, a lot of investors, foreign investors as well as Chinese investors, they've taken over quite a bit of the global supply chains, and that reduced trade intensity in the world, but also trade intensity for China. And second, because China is getting richer, non-tradable goods becomes more expensive than tradable goods, and therefore trade as a share of GDP will decline almost automatically. You see the United States is just still lower than China in terms of its share of trade in GDP. So in part it's economics, and in part is logically explained. Not all of this is decoupling. But where you see decoupling is, if you want, in a very broad picture where China is moving its exports to. And there you see a major shift away from G7 and EU towards what I call belt and road economies. The idea of this chart comes from the Financial Times, but I replicated it. And this has been a trend that is not very recent. As you can see, it is a trend that started already right after China's entry into the WTO. So China has been decoupling from G7 and EU countries in a statistical term quite a bit longer than the talk of the town suggests. Belt and road economies are now the majority of exports. There's a little bit of overlap because some EU countries are member or MOU signers in the Belt and Road. But this is a picture which sort of China sees also as its future, frankly, because they see increasing trade tensions with China, maybe with the EU. And so they're focusing more on emerging economies and Belt and Road economies. I call this the long goodbye because China has also been decoupling from the United States, again, in a statistical term. For a long time, the US share in China's import has been on the decline from its peak in the early 2000s. Then here we see the Trump years where it was a major downturn, an upturn again during COVID, but there's now really a downturn. China's share in US exports, however, only most recently started to turn down. And as you see, sort of the same pattern, the Trump pattern, and then the peak again during COVID, and now we have it on a downward trajectory. Whereas the US share in China imports has again been on the downside for quite a long time, and the China share in US imports, in contrast, has only recently started turning down. So the decoupling for China has been going on for a very long time. For the US, decoupling from China is a relatively new phenomenon after the Trump administration, if you want. Now, that's not the end of the story. China is finding a backdoor into the United States, because whereas China's share in the US imports has been majorly declining, other countries, especially ASEAN countries with Mexico, Vietnam highlighted here, and even the EU, have seen an increase in its share. And of course, China has found the back door because China's share of imports of Vietnam has spiked, and in Mexico has spiked as well. So quite a bit of this trade movement is away from direct trade from China to the US, and now indirectly through ASEAN countries and through Mexico. That may not go on forever, but for now, that is definitely, in the past couple of years, that has definitely been a trend. Just focusing on the countries of our focus, Germany, the Netherlands, Japan, and Singapore, clearly the import share from imports from China has increased since the mid-90s. I show only data till 2020 because here I want to do value added. But clearly, China has become much more important for the Germanys, the Netherlands, Japan, and Singapore of the world. In value added terms, it's even clearer that the value added of China's exports in the final demand of the countries of focus has increased quite strongly. In part, that reflects that China has been moving up the value chain, as we know. So their inputs into other economies has become more valuable, and the value added, Chinese value added per dollar imported from China has simply increased. Now, in terms of reliance and dependencies on China, I think these are the best charts to look at. And for the EU, it's actually for all, it's the same. There is an increased dependence on China, but some parts of the world do better than others. And this shows the share of China in EU value-added imports in manufacturing, and same for China, for the EU in China's manufacturing. And so this upline is a major increase in dependency, if you want, of the EU on China inputs, and the China's dependency on the EU is more or less flat. Same for the United States, which is doing less well than the EU, and the increase in dependency on China's value added. And same for the countries of interest, absolutely similar, an increased dependence on China. China has decoupled from Japan again for a very long time, and quite dramatically so. It was very dependent on Japan in the mid-90s, much less so now. Finally, this is a chart that is interesting, because here's where you see the shift in global value chains happening. And ASEAN is practically the only part of the world that has seen an increase in its value added in Chinese manufacturing. Yes, they become more dependent on Chinese value added, but they see an increase in their value added from about 5% in the mid-90s to about 10% now. And the reason for that is interesting. You see to some extent a shift away from China towards Southeast Asia. And that's still quite micro data, but I can't resist in showing this. This is not in the report, but Macro Polo just put this out. And here you see a shift of, this is suppliers for Apple. And Apple, of course, is a major producer in China. And in the beginning, there was an increase, if you want, in the share of suppliers that were based in China for Apple. But in the latest data, the 22 data, that share has actually decreased, forgive me. And the share of Southeast Asian suppliers that give inputs into Apple's production has increased. So that's, if you want, decoupling away from China, but it's a regional decoupling. It's going to Southeast Asia, and that's likely to be a pattern going forward, given the very strong trade agreements that China has with Southeast Asia. Let me stop here and listen to Frank and Floris. Thank you.
Very good. Well, I'm not going to say anything. I mean, not about the report, but thank you for the guys. Thank you so much, Bert. Just a quick question. I don't know whether you can hear me, but what conclusion in the report has most taken you by surprise? What do you find most remarkable? If you would have to name one thing. Oh, now you're not. So hang on, I can't hear you now.
I'm sorry. So there's two things. One is that I'm actually surprised that you already can see quite a bit of it in the data, and there's trends that I think are going. So we're at the start of decoupling, and that is going to go further. Second, and that is reinforced by what we hear from the companies. They're reluctant. It would be kicking and screaming. But they also realize that actually they can't avoid some of the decoupling, some of the tension, some of the issues, and that therefore what we see in the data is the beginning of a trend that will probably last another decade or so.
Okay, thank you so much. You're going to stay with us for the rest of the session, so thank you very much for that, because I know the time difference is quite big. But thanks very much for that. I am constantly tempted to turn towards you in the screen, but of course I have to turn towards the camera. So forgive me for that. Anyway, I'm now joined also for the people at home. They can now see Pieke for the first time. So very warm welcome. Straight from Singapore and going back to Singapore fairly in a couple of days, I think. You conducted most of the interviews using a few of the researchers' help, so you interviewed roughly 60, 70 companies. What kind of companies, can you sort of ballpark the nature of the companies? Are they multinationals? Are they small ones? Well, yeah.
They're deliberately a mix of companies. So we have, of course, tried to interview as many of the really big players as possible, multinationals and really world-leading companies. But we also very deliberately try to focus on small ones, including very small ones that are targeted, for instance, just China in their strategy. Moreover, we try to get a good spread over different sectors of the economy. So not just semiconductors, but also banks, asset managers, firms working in chemical production, construction materials. Very important also real estate companies. That's particularly important for Singapore. A couple of very large real estate companies that are state-linked companies that are very heavily invested in China, and we did interviews with several of them as well. So it's a broad spectrum. Of course, it isn't perfect because there are certain sectors that are underrepresented, like let's say the weapons industry. These people don't want to talk to you.
Well, I was going to say that how keen were these other companies that did in the end talk to you?
Yes.
How keen were they to talk to you?
Well, it was very, very hard. Well, some companies are very easy.
Is any company mentioned by name in the report?
Oh, not at all. We don't manage any names, any people. There's also no direct quotes in there.
That was the only way to get them to talk.
That was the only way to get them to talk. And that's already an indication of how sensitive this issue is, right? How difficult it is for these people to openly express their views because it's so politically touchy. And they could only speak about it, they wanted only to speak about it when they were completely anonymous. And even then I had to sort of pull them by the hairs to get an interview quite often. Approach them 3 or 4 times through different channels with different people that I know. And eventually they would then yield. But it was, you know.
Did you use torture? No.
Not quite, but sometimes I used extortion.
Right. By the way, speaking of extortion, I am aware of the fact that there is at least one journalist taking part in this session. He's at home from Bloomberg. I just want to stress that although there is going to be recording online later on, and the report is public, but let's keep what's being said here under Chatham House rule. And if you want to interview somebody at a later date, please call them directly or call us. So I just want to flag that up. So when you look at decoupling, you mentioned a number of strategies. There is a complete withdrawal. There is the so-called China for China, the ring fencing, to limit the exposure to China, diversification of supply lines and production in other countries, and do nothing. So that's basically 5 flavors, if you like. Can you say which of those flavors stands out as being most
well in terms of absolute numbers of companies? The do nothing at all is probably the most important, and that's of course dominated by smaller companies who don't have a choice, right? They're too small to really start seriously thinking about either siloing of the China operations or setting up shop elsewhere. So they have to stick with China and just hope for the best. What they do, however, is try to come up with some kind of contingency plans. Okay, if it really gets a lot worse, how are we going to pull out without losing all of our assets? That's basically the question they're asking, and that's basically so the nuclear button kind of issue. You know, if a war happens between China and the US or something like that, right? And Taiwan, of course, is always flagged as a major issue in that. So that's the main thing for the small companies, including Singapore companies, but also Dutch companies, German companies, and Japanese companies. The really large ones, of course, have both the necessity and the wherewithal, financial and otherwise, organizationally, to do all of these things at the same time. So they're not exclusive for them. So they silo off the China operations, make them as much independent or autonomous from the main global company as they possibly can, financially, in terms of management, data management, human resources, obviously, try to silo all of that off. But the next step that big companies are taking is also then focusing the production and the product development and innovation and research specifically on the Chinese economy, the Chinese market. So it's not just a management issue or financial issue. The company's China operations become a genuinely separate operation with its own market strategy, its own product development strategy. And you see that particularly with big companies happening very, very rapidly now. But
they produce for China and they produce for the rest of the world, basically.
They produce in China for China.
Yeah, okay.
And they increasingly choose no longer to export from China. So that kind of operation, the export business, is then moved to a very large extent to other countries, to Southeast Asia, as Bert explained to us, or to Mexico, or to other countries. There's also the China Plus One strategy, which is complementary to this, that they set up separate operations like they have in China already in another big country, and that can be in Southeast Asia, which is a very attractive growth market, can be in India in particular. So you see these companies basically trying to shorten their supply chains and shorten their marketing chains, and shorten and reduce their exposure to global risk by becoming more local in more different places. However, what Bert also showed us is that the supply chains continue to exist through the United States, but then they are rerouted through Southeast Asia or Mexico in particular, when it's Europe, and sometimes through Eastern Europe. So one of the real takeaways is here that supply chains in one respect may shorten, may be more localized, but on the other hand, they actually get lengthened, they get longer because they're now routed through other countries. So you see a lot of Chinese value added being produced in China, high-level intermediary goods that are then exported to, say, Malaysia or Vietnam, then be put together and then exported to the United States or sometimes to Europe. So all of these things happen at the same time, and that's the fascinating thing. There isn't just one answer. There are many answers, but the common thing about them is that they try to hedge their bets, they try to limit their exposure to geopolitical risk, and they try to bet on more horses than just one.
And when it's about geopolitical risk for their company, what is the thing that they mention, which is, what are they most worried about?
That's not a leading question at all. And that took me by surprise, and that to me is the main finding, apart from the fact of, what I just talked about, so this diversification of strategy. Their main fear and the main worry is because the United States. They are really afraid of the United States, or what the United States is doing, is imposing on them, and is making them, forcing them to do. But not all of that. The main thing is that they don't yet know what is still to happen. So it's insecurity of American policies regarding China, trade policies, weaponization of all kinds of issues in the relationship between China and the United States. That's what worries them. And they look into the future and say, okay, this is what we got. We can just about deal with it now. But what if it gets worse? What are we going to do then? How are we going to deal with that? And that is what.
How could it get worse?
It could. Well, the thing that they usually mention is a war over Taiwan.
Okay.
Which is, of course, well, that's basically the end of civilization as we know it, probably, at least for these companies. But there's all kinds of smaller issues that could also flare up. But that's the one they always mention. But the important thing about this is that they don't blame China. They're very, very clear. That China, of course, they have lots of worries about China. The usual worries, in particular, worry a lot about the lack of economic management, the mismanagement of the Chinese economy. They're very worried about that as well. But that's a different issue, right? It's a very serious issue, but it's a different issue. But when they look at geopolitical conflict and the geopolitical confrontation, they squarely point at the United States. They say this is where the problem started, and this is where we have to deal with. And the problem is not so much for the China operations, because they know they can silo them off, right, and make them more autonomous from the rest of the company. No, the real blowback will come for the global company as a whole. Because what they say, and I spoke to some people very high up in these companies, and they spent sometimes 2 or 3 hours just ranting, because they really had to get rid of a lot of anger. They said, what will happen, for instance, if the United States says, you can't do business in China anymore in these and these areas, and we continue to do so? What will happen to operations in America? Moreover, what will happen to our operations elsewhere, to the extraterritorial application of American law? Right? So they say, one of them even said, I fear for my own personal safety. If I travel to America under such conditions, right? I mean, this is not happening now, but if this whole happens and I were to travel to America, will I be arrested at the airport? That's, it is that bad. And I think that message is, very important, very powerful. And I think we really in Europe should take that very seriously, because we should not travel down that road. We should not co-travel with America along this path and decouple and weaponize our relationship with China simply to contain China, to make life difficult for China. We should de-risk, right? I hate the word, but anyway, it's a useful word. And we should try to look at our own national interest. Where do relationships with China really bite us and produce risks and dangers, and where don't they? But don't try to work with China or try to do things to China simply because you want to contain it or you want to limit its rights, as the Americans openly admit that they do, right? That is, I think, the most important message that comes out of this.
And just to stress, this is the same for companies from the Netherlands, Germany, Singapore, and Japan. They more or less.
Yeah, they also, all of them say, including the Japanese, they say, what we want is our governments to be more sensible in the relationship between China and the US, be more sort of on an even keel, as it were. And the companies from Singapore say, well, that's what we like about our government, that they do that, right? So the Singapore case is exceptional because Singapore is already doing it. The Germans, the Dutch, and the Japanese complain about their government specifically. They go along with the United States way too much, they say. And they say it very openly because it's an anonymous interview. They would never say that in public. But I can do that.
Very interesting. I'm just gonna, yes, thank you, Angelique. If you could please state your name, and because at home people can't see you, so I'll repeat the question.
I'm working for the Netherlands Foreign Investment Agency, which is an executing organization of the Ministry of Foreign Economic Affairs. I have one question on the content of the companies you interviewed with 16, 17. Are they international companies, or are they Dutch companies? Are they? I missed that because I also I'm a little bit surprised that the most companies apparently point the finger at the insecurity of actions from the United States, whereas if China would invade or take over, I don't know how to say that, Taiwan, China is the aggressor. So US is the reactor. So I find it I'm a little bit surprised that the companies point the finger at.
Well, no, but they're business.
But so your companies, what is the nature of the companies and why are they concerned?
There are twofold. I mean, if they are US companies, they probably will not point the finger at their US.
Oh, they do.
They might, but
oh yes, they do.
So I want to know what is the.
Well, but don't forget, these are companies. They're not interested in right or wrong, good or evil. They just want to do business, right? So to them, the Taiwan war would simply be an external event that they have to deal with. And they don't care who causes it, right? They mention Taiwan because they say if a war over Taiwan happens, or the South China Sea, then that will be possible. That's all they care about. They don't care who is at fault. That's not their problem. That's not what they have to deal with, right? They're not government, they're companies.
Very good. Sorry, I will give you the floor in a minute. I want to just stress to people at home, if they want to ask a question, please do so in the chat by typing it out, and then I'll repeat, or Emma will repeat the question. But please ask your question, state your name, and ask your question, please.
My name is Frans Paul van der Putten, and my question is, did you companies also have a strategy that they're not using at the moment, but that they would use if a war would break out? For instance, would companies, other companies that would consider, do they have an exit strategy? So how would they deal with all the assets that they then have in China?
Most of them would not want to discuss that. Because I say this gets into territory that is really internal to our own operations. We don't want to talk about it, but we're talking about it internally. How are we going to deal when the proverbial spaghetti hits the fan? But what they usually say, and that is important, is say if push comes really to shove, and we have no choice, we will have to go along with the Americans. Because at the end of the day, our operations in America are bigger. The dollar is more important. Wall Street is more important than anything that China has to offer. But they say, we would hate to do this. We don't want to do it. But if we are forced to do that, then we will.
Right. But isn't that also the consideration of the governments then, to kind of pander to America's whims, so to speak, because they realize that's apparent, that's ultimately where.
Sure. Well, that's my plea.
Okay. Very good.
What I would hope that European governments, or the Japanese government for that matter as well, do is to not let themselves led by the nose by the Americans. Don't pander to, don't go along with an American security agenda. I can understand that America wants to stay number one. Right? Well, I don't approve of it, but they want to stay number one. I can sort of understand that. And if you want to stay number one and you want to keep number two down, then what they're doing is very rational. But it's not a European strategy. It's not in our interests in Europe. So we should go along as long as it sort of caters to our own national security and security interests, but not because it simply caters to the American. So that is my main plea. I know it's asking a lot, and it's probably not going to happen, but that's what I would hope.
Arnie, please.
Yeah, a bit along that line. Arnie Bowers. For me, this is very much a narrow business focus, and I can imagine that this is what business says, but that's also what business had been saying in Russia before the invasion in Ukraine. So basically, my feeling is you can't have your cake and eat it. So yes, if we want a security umbrella from the United States, you have to also listen to their interests and maybe work on that as well. So I'm glad that you say in the end, yes, the US is more important, because just narrow business interest is sort of short focused. It's and I would say well, take some other interests into account as well. And if we have a war in on the continent of Europe, then and we expect the Americans to help defend us, then it makes sense to also talk to them about all sorts of business issues. So I'm complicated a little.
Yes, but this comparison between Russia, Ukraine, and China, Taiwan, for instance, is always made. But I do think they're very different for us in Europe, because Taiwan is really far away and Ukraine is not. So in that sense, you could make a genuine, legitimate argument. I'm not saying that I support that, but you could make the argument that we have no direct security problems with China as Europe, whereas we do have that with Russia.
Yeah, but I don't make the comparison to Taiwan, so that's not me.
But there is no
we
threat.
have dealings with the US concerning Ukraine, and it means that on the whole.
Yeah, but I don't think we should. But this goes beyond the research, right? This is about opinions. This is about what you would like the world to be like. But I don't think that because we want the US to help us defend ourselves against Russia, which I, by the way, don't think we need, but it's another matter. That we then should also go along with their agenda in China. I think we should really keep them apart in our dealings with the United States. But that takes us way beyond the research. The research deliberately looked at business, because one of the things that baffled me when I started this pipe up, they don't really speak out on these things. Particularly in Europe, you hear very little from business about these big geopolitical questions regarding China, because they're afraid, right? The whole atmosphere around China and around geopolitics is against them. So they have nowhere to go in political spectrum. There's nowhere where they can go with their arguments. So they, of course, lobby, sub rosa, but you hear very little coming from them in the media, through politics and so on. And that came across very clearly also in the interview. They said, well, where do we go, right? With our agenda, with our interests. Nobody wants to listen to us.
I see two questions in the room, but there's also, I think, a question via the chat, a couple of questions. Okay, I'm gonna take two questions from the chat, I suppose, and then go back to the room. Emma, please.
One question from Nana de Graat, our friend. What strategies/routes do companies see to de-risk from the US? Where and how do they lobby? Like you said. And then a question from Ed Sander. Do you think the current trends of moving trade investments away from China is resulting in overcapacity in Chinese factories, and combined with a slowdown in the domestic market, what do you think they will do to solve that?
Okay, these are very
both questions are too far, because maybe Bert can answer the second one. Possibly.
Sure, Bert can do the second one. The first is very simple. They don't talk about decoupling from the US at all, because they know they need the US much more than China or any place in the world. What they do talk about a lot is how can we minimize the risk that comes from the United States. But they know full well that they can't run a global company without the United States, and not just the United States, but also Wall Street and the dollar. It's impossible. So decoupling from the United States is simply not on the cards. It's not an option.
And the second question, Bert, do you have an answer for Ed Sander?
Well, so I have the answers really that I don't think they're very strongly linked. I mean, I think there is an issue with growing capacity. I mean, I know the Europeans call it overcapacity, but growing capacity in manufacturing in China. And that is really, I do think that goes back to a geopolitical issue in part, i.e. moving away resources from real estate development, from infrastructure to manufacturing. I think the leadership in China feels very comfortable with that. The problem is that there's not sufficient domestic demand, so we get growing surpluses in manufacturing coming from China. That's a fact. The moving away, I think that is still too small to say that is really significant. Even if you look at sort of the absolute numbers, in China's overall production, it's, they have 30% of manufacturing in the world. Only a little bit of that goes to the United States. So I don't think that is actually very significant at this particular point in time. Thanks.
significant.
Sorry, what was it? You don't think it's very significant? You kind of
No, that moving out of China does not cause overcapacity in China.
Okay.
There's other forces that do, and that is China's policy to move away from property, moving it into manufacturing, if you want. And I'm saying that's not all organized. It's not that they sort of, everything is not everything is planned, but that's happening at the moment, and that causes some of the surpluses that you see emerging in manufacturing in China.
Okay, thank you.
Can I add to that?
Yes, please.
And this is a point that Bert himself actually made on an earlier occasion, and that the current economic policy, if you want to call it that, of the Chinese government is still very much predicated on export. So they have a new policy of the new productive forces and innovation and all that, but at the end of the day, that produces not just for the Chinese market, but also for foreign markets, right? So they have an economic strategy that is still very much focused on export, rather than on building up domestic demand in China itself. So there is a real mismatch between what they're doing and what they actually ought to be doing. So they continue to make themselves dependent on the world, whereas what they should be doing is become more autonomous.
Thank you for that. In the back of the room, there are two questions. Valerie, please.
Yes, Valerie Hoeks, China Emerals. First of all, I really recognize and acknowledge everything you're saying about the strategies companies have. As you know, we're working with those companies. But one concern I would have in their place is that while localizing, while making it a more standalone profit center, the only thing that remains is the financials going from China back to the headquarters. And in a project, for example, that I also co-created in together with Pascal, we noticed how people fear the profit repatriation, and facts show today still that it is not an issue. But this insecurity that you refer to may actually impact that. So then I wonder, and I already see that happening with some of the Dutch big companies. They have a total standalone profit center, but what is then in the end still not Chinese? And
this is a very, very good point. In the report, I actually point this out, that the logical conclusion of what is currently happening with and by these companies would be that the China operations become fully independent Chinese companies with no connection anymore to the global company. And my question that I ask in the report is that what we want? I don't think so.
I have an extensive question to exactly that point, because it's very
Your name, please, sorry.
Oh, sorry, Albert Steinhardt. I have a consultancy called Dragon Strategies. I'm the author of Dragon Tactics, and I spent about 26 years living and working in China for about multinational Chinese. Sorry.
Meanwhile, we have a hulplijn. Yeah.
Yeah, this is the Ministry of National Security. That fell out. Okay. Not too good here.
Excellent. Sorry.
My question was that.
No, that's it.
People don't give up, right?
I think we're gonna have to go to drinks now because.
Okay, third time lucky. It is very clear that in boardrooms in China, among people based in China, running businesses in China, there's a very different attitude and thinking about decoupling than there is by boards of the parent company abroad.
Absolutely.
What you just said, we don't want to go to a world where the China business is completely separate. So have you in your research come across discussions, dilemmas between should we follow the Chinese board by saying let's stay versus the global board who overrules? And if you have come across that, who wins and what are the arguments? And
I get your point. This is a very good question, and I pursued this also in the interviews, particularly also because we try to interview both in China and in Europe, Singapore, or Japan. So we have for about 15, 20 companies, we have voices from both sides. And it's very clear that people who work in China for many companies, they tend to be mostly Chinese or returned Chinese, but also the foreigners that work for them, they are much more China focused. They can't believe that the company would ever sort of at least partially pull out of China and invest elsewhere. It's something that they can't imagine ever to happen. And then they point, of course, to the still fantastic opportunities that China has to offer, the potential for growth, and so on and so forth. Whereas at the headquarters, there's two things going on. First of all, at the headquarters, particularly in Europe, but also in Japan, people are much more influenced by the very negative press that China has. So people tend to go along much more with the anti-China craze that is currently happening all over the developed world. And that really influences their perspective, and that particularly happened during COVID, when headquarters was mainly cut off from the China operations. At least they couldn't travel there, they couldn't see what was actually happening. Now that's getting a little bit better, people going back to China again, and local staff can say, oh, you know, it is actually not so bad, you know, and that actually is accepted, and investment because of that is picking up again. But there's also, of course, another argument, which is much more business oriented, and that at the headquarters, they take a global view. They say, okay, yes, we can invest more in China, and that will make a profit. But if we invest in Argentina or Uzbekistan, then perhaps you can make more. And that's something you never ever get, of course, from people operating in China, working in China, because they simply don't know. It's not part of their universe, right? So it's a mix of political factors and simple business decisions that tend to pull these two apart, the headquarters and the China operations. There is a bit of repair going on after COVID, but it's still a really big issue.
If I may add, you clearly see that in the report we quote some UBS data that actually look at the headquarter chief financial officers, and they really are very strongly looking at diversification. And that is like 70-80% of the companies, whereas the companies in China, the European Chamber, well, 15%. The Americans, 25% looks at diversification. So there's a very different kind of view. One additional point, there's also, as Frank said, there's economics at work. And that's why I'm still hesitant to call the big drop in 2023 in FDI sort of decoupling, because the whole economics has changed. Now you can get risk-free 5% return in the United States in US Treasuries. In China, the return on assets is now 4%, and it's come down quite dramatically, frankly, over the past 10 years. And so it pays less and less to be in China, and that's something that the Chinese companies don't see. That, frankly, I think also the Chinese government doesn't see. That there's, in addition to the decoupling forces, which are clearly there, there's just.
Sorry, Bert, you broke up. The Chinese companies don't see what?
They don't see that global view, that now it's much easier with the new macroeconomics, with high interest rates in Europe, in the United States, to make money outside China. Whereas before, China was the only game in town, no longer so.
So the issue basically is very simple. China is basically and America is a highly inflation economy, and then money goes to where the inflation happens. It's as simple as that.
I think there's one more question in the chat.
Yes, for Bert, to what extent are these trends you highlighted indications of decoupling, or rather recoupling, geographical shifts in flows of trade and investments? Again, from Nana de Graaf.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Nana. That's a very good question. That's why I hesitate to call it all decoupling, because it's not. There's lots of things at work. Some of them make perfect economic sense, as I just said. I do believe that, and that's why these interviews are so important, because they give a granular view on what companies are actually at least thinking about, maybe not yet doing, but at least thinking about, because just looking at the data, you cannot distinguish. In an ideal world, and I can't do it, but maybe real researchers from University of Amsterdam, Free University of Amsterdam, what you want to have a counterfactual. So if you make, say, an FDI model, a gravity-based FDI model, and then you start looking at the divergences from the model outcome, that's where you could say, okay, well, this is sort of what we can't explain, and that may have something to do with decoupling. And if that discrepancy becomes bigger, say after 2017, i.e. the Trump shock, 2022, the Ukraine shock, that's when you can sort that out a bit more. We don't have the data yet. Maybe a couple of years from now, the data is richer, and then we can start doing that type of analysis. Thanks for the question.
Thank you very much. There's room for one or two more questions, and then we have to sadly wrap up.
I actually just wanted to add an example from my practice where one of our clients actually wants to localize and signed all kinds of agreements to move the entire production facility to China, and then all of a sudden surprisingly pulled out because of economic reasons. So they found out just before everything was there that the market was rapidly changing, and that their key client didn't manage to sell their stuff. So for them, and it was a surprise to them as well, that was the reason to step out. And indeed, that you cannot see in the charts that Bert shows.
Right. Did you get that, Bert? Just okay, good. We're gonna have to wrap up, but not before. I first want to thank the CKN, obviously, which is quite a unique collaboration of all the departments working together to answer the important China-related questions at the moment. So CKN and this particular research was supported by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, obviously, but also Economic Affairs supported it. So many thanks to that.
And the East Asian Institute.
And the East Asian Institute. Thank you very much. Very good for that plug as well. So we are going to finish in a minute. We'll walk over to Hofman, which is just down the street, to have a couple of drinks, and if you are interested anyway. And let me just finish by asking both of you a final question, which is, this research is now finished. What should be what should be follow-up research?
Okay, well, I have 10 answers to that.
Excellent.
But I'll give you just one of the one that we are currently developing at the East Asian Institute. And that is looking at decoupling and recoupling at the same time. Because as decoupling happens, companies, Chinese companies, but also foreign companies, are looking for ways to reconnect with the world economy in different ways. So that's what we're going to look at by focusing specifically on Chinese. So we're now moving from the periphery to the center of the conflict.
And
for me, I mean, similar. Look, researchers always say we need to do more research, but in this case, because it's such a moving target, it actually makes sense to regularly look at that. And I think a next version would sort of inform companies where the ball is going much more than the current one. And that's very important information for companies and actually as well for governments. The second, we see a lot of prospects for case studies, both at the company level, but also at the country level. We really found that Japan and Korea, they've been decoupling a lot earlier due to circumstances, and see how both the government as well as companies have dealt with digging more into sort of specific cases. I think is very important. There's a third element, of course. It's a very rich area. That's how is Southeast Asia dealing with China, and is there a lot of movement, as many people suspect, of Chinese companies into Southeast Asia? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bert, and thank you so much for joining us at this late hour. I have a small present for Frank, I'm afraid, but he might share it when you see him.
No way.
I was thinking of flowers, but as you're leaving for Singapore in a couple of days, that's pointless. So perhaps
because I always take stroopwafels with me.
Excellent.
Don't have to buy it now.
So, and I'd like to thank Mark Moquet, obviously, from CKN, and Fios Esan, Vera, Eric, and Emma for supporting this project. And thank you so much for now. Please join me at Hofman in a minute. Thank you so much.